Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
This thread is for psychosis stories. I know some of you had a psychosis, and if any board, then X is the board for it. Before I start by telling my story, though, I want to tell you about a dream that I had as a child, several times, which made my psychosis even more terrifying for me. When I was about 5 or 6, I kept having dreams that definitely didn't play in this world. It started with me going down an elevator. It wasn't a real elevator, it was a metaphysical elevator in a sense, and I could see it descending into an endless abyss. In this elevator was someone whom I didn't really recognize, but I felt as if he was a friend I had for eternity. While the elevator was going down, he was being honorable, and I felt as if I knew what was coming. Once the elevator hit rock bottom, I was greeted by my family. I knew that it was my family, even though it was also comprised of beings I didn't know. They were greeting me with sadistic laughter. The fear and terror I felt from then on was indescribable. From then on, it felt like I was being crushed between two infinitely large orbs, feeling infinitely small. This seemed to go on forever while I knew that my family was still laughing. Even my mom was laughing, and when I cried out for her support, she laughed even more, which is the exact opposite of what my mom would do in real life. This terror was only increased by the fact that I kept having visions of an old lady who sat on a bench alone. It was like she was trying to tell me what I did wrong while I was suffering. And then, at the end, I would always feel the exact opposite of comfy. It was like having to lay on a rubble of crude metal while being crushed under it as well. And then the whole scenario would repeat itself. I'm still struggling with what this dream really meant. Was it something my soul has experienced? Is it something I will experience? I find that highly unlikely, since the concept of some sort of divine punishment doesn't make sense to me. The only meaning I can find is that I had this dream, so my psychosis experience would be even more terrifying for me. I'll continue with my psychosis story. It all started with me trying shrooms with some of my friends. It wasn't a very pleasurable experience. It wasn't really bad either. But I had a vision of a pyramid with a double helix sort of formation floating around it, and it was all made out of bright, shining, non-physical materials. This vision led me to become interested in spirituality for the first time. I started with simple stuff, but it really began when I read the Kybalion. I felt as if I understood the hidden meaning in those words. I was also interested in Kabbalah and the Sephirot, even though I think I never understood how it is meant to be understood. I felt as if I had an actual connection to the highest of Sephirots, Kether. Through my own will, I was able to feel massive energies come into my head from my crown chakra. I also began practicing meditation and did try to open my third eye. One morning I woke up and I could suddenly see all things shine with a bright color. It was like there was another layer of color on top of everything that I couldn't see before. This was so intense that I was actually worried that when someone asked me what color something is, that I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I still can see these colors nowadays, actually, just not as strongly. If I try, I can enhance this ability, but I'm fine with how it is. When I came to school this day, I noticed that there was new graffiti on the wall, and it depicted the wings of an angel, and I obviously thought that this was a sign. During school, I was also certain that I was able to move my pens simply with the force of my will at least once. Then after school, I knew exactly where my friends would be and went there, and they were there, and I smoked with them. Then suddenly, after I started talking to them about spiritual things and telling them that if one feels better than the other feels worse, as I thought that this was a way of how energies work, and they all gathered up on me and stared at me, and I was terrified. They were obviously just making fun of me, but at this time I was already so lost in my own world. Then something rather creepy happened after this, and in a moment where I was alone with one of my friends, he suddenly looked really weird at me, and I felt as if a dark presence was in him. He looked at me and said, "Everyone gets one ticket." Later I asked him about that, and he didn't remember it, although I'm absolutely sure that he said this to me. I was obviously worried that I had somehow betrayed the ticket I got and thought of all kinds of scary things. After this day, I got more immersed in spirituality, and more so with magic. First, I believed in demons and was rather Christian, but abolished those ideas later. I started practicing magic and even did rituals, some even with success. At least in the sense that what I had asked for happened for me. There were also a lot of weird things that happened to me. Like one day in physics class, the teacher was doing an experiment up front where he would shoot balls into the air with some device. Each time he did so, I thought I was able to use my willpower to make them fly further. The weirdest thing, however, was that the students in front of me began joking and claiming that they were doing this with the ball, even though I talked with no one the whole class. There was also an incident where one of my friends came over. He was making fun of me being such a lunatic behind my back, as my friends were jerks back then. After a while, we sat in front of each other and I tried communicating with him telepathically. He didn't say anything and I was sure we were having a conversation over telepathy. After it was over, he got up and said, "This was rather interesting." Later, he sat down beside me and suddenly I felt as if he was serving Satan. I then began battling him, imagining a holy war going on between us. He looked even sort of mad at me. After he left, I was suddenly hit with mental attacks telling me that I cannot do anything. I was fighting it with my will and I was scared for my life, but after a while was able to get over it. Later he said, "I was having so much fun after I left after I told him that I think that for each joy felt there is suffering somewhere else." This, and a lot more of these kinds of things happened to me, but it all began getting really scary one day while I was taking a bath to cleanse myself spiritually, like I did often back then. I was using my mind to choose the timeline to go to next while I did so while I was suddenly having a vision of some kind of lab, and I was being tested on by the military like in the movie District 9. It was the most terrifying thing for me so far back then, apart from my dream at least. I kept worrying about this timeline manifesting itself for weeks, and while looking outside, sometimes believed I saw people from the government or the Illuminati watching me. A while after this, I became so fearful that I was afraid of losing control over my mental ability. I was also quite delusional about my role. I even thought I was above everything at times. In the end, I thought I was the one, which meant to me that I have been every other human being that ever lived on this planet, even in the future, and that each person in this world was just a past life of me, and that this life I'm living now is the final life of this one soul that is me, and thus the hardest one. I thought that my mission was to change this world forever, so I could ascend to the next higher dimension to be a king there. But since I was so fearful and thought I was losing control over my abilities, I began receiving messages. First mentally, then even in real life by events that only I could interpret this way that told me to get a hold of myself. Then they began threatening me. It all started breaking down when I finally, after many failures and even the chance to go back to my old state and lose my abilities, which they really did for me, but I chose to try using my abilities again. They told me that I have now lost this challenge. I was then told that I have tried fulfilling this final mission 2 times already, and that they turned the time back after each try. Each time I was captured by the Illuminati and first tortured for 3 years in the first try and then for over 20 years, until I was allowed to die with 43 in the second try. It was planned that if I were to fail the 3rd time, I would accept my punishment to be then only tortured for 3 years, and then still left to be king over the next higher dimension. I began having intense visions, even smelling the torture I thought I had endured during my past tries. My task then was to accept, in my mind, that I will now be tortured for 3 years, and after a while they would come get me and torture me. But my fear was so intense that I had started losing control over my mind. I couldn't stop myself from thinking that I would make it worse, so I made it worse. After a few days, they increased the years. Then they told me that every time I smoke a cigarette, they'd torture me more. I couldn't help it, and stupidly enough, I kept smoking. Then they told me they were going to kill me, and then revive me in a clone of my body again. This got so bad that it got almost comical, as the amount of deaths was soon over 1,000. I couldn't help but think of jokes about it in my mind, and at some point, they began picking that up. And I had intense visions of crude laughter and viciously comical torture devices they'd use on me. Things totally lost control once they told me I lost all my chances, and that now I will be tortured in the next dimension, and then eventually the next, until I was to be tortured through all dimensions. I lost all hope after running around in nature, being scared of being captured at home for days when the universe told me I was to be the only soul that would be damned for eternity. They began calling me a glitch in the game because I had lost control over my own being, and my only use was to serve for entertainment for all other souls by enduring infinite pain. They made it so bad that I was to be trapped in a place where the pain that has been felt in this entire universe through all time was to be felt by me in 1 second, and that if I feared it would go worse, it would go worse. And if I feared it would go 100 times as worse, it would, each second, only increasing my pain to absurdly large numbers over eternity. I even had communication from my ex-friends then, who joked about it more and more. Even my family did, and all the other beings.
I remember having one when I found out about the whole anonymous internet nonsense. Had another one when I found out that none gave a shit. Creepy stuff. My bullshit filter sort of disappeared, and I was open-minded to a lot of crap. Thinking back on it, it was also an amazing time. Never felt more alive and really felt I was part of something big. I felt special.
Well, I simply wanted to tell this story once and saw this as an opportunity to do so. I may not get many reactions, but I'm sure at least 10 people read it. Even if not, I saved this text for later use, and I wanted to write down my psychosis anyways. What are you implying anyways? That anonymous image boards are useless because no one gives a shit? That this amount of effort is wasted on a place like this? But perhaps you really meant none of that and it was just a shit post. Which seems the most likely to me, but at least I got one reply.
Well, what you experienced was something similar to a ritual to make you achieve a higher awakening. I went with something similar, except at some point I lost all fears by abandoning my ego. That was the key. After that, the psychosis became more clearer as I wasn't doing it for myself. Then I didn't exist at all on this point. I spent 3 full months of psychosis, figuring how the universe and the fabric of reality was made of. The mission I had was to find a solution to fix the matrix. I found out pretty easily by literally cheating. I implemented an algorithm in my mind to find solution in the timeline, something similar to a deduce of reality, will explain if you ask. Then I tried to come back to normality, but failed. I was still in full psychosis, so I did a self-end attempt by knife, which nearly worked, but my time there had come to an end, so I didn't die. Then they put me in a psychiatric hospital on heavy medicine to get me down. 2 weeks later, I had recovered. Then I went back to real life, sorting all the shit I left undone for years. I just finally done all the analyzing of what I exactly did and what it meant to the world. I may be responsible for something or two, but who knows, I just may be a PSY patient or the Maitreya.
Well, yes, it is similar to a ritual in a way, as it made me lose all my fears concerning this reality. As long as I will be, I can depend on my being able to handle my reality to such an extent that even when I suffer, I know why and have a reason to go through it. But in hindsight, it also eliminated a lot of the errors a human consciousness often permits when dealing with spiritual processes, things such as a bias or assumptions. However, the way I profited from this the most was by how I recovered from this. This is quite an esoteric thing, but we're on X here anyways, so yeah. I'm pretty sure that by experiences that triggered intense emotions in me in my time of recovery, I was able to breach the veil between human consciousness and the source of creation, or call it God or whatever. I'm not saying my connection was absolute. From all, I think it was merely a tincture of what is really there, but I was able to feel a love which not only cured me of my fear of punishment after death, but also led to me having a much higher standard for everything, as in a standard in a philosophical sense, or even morally. The other thing this did for me was disconnect me so much from the human consciousness that I feel that I am not part of all the conflicts and issues that paralyze the collective human consciousness, which gives me the opportunity to look at things from a much more abstract, wider, and open perspective. Also, I don't think you can cheat reality. It is in itself complete and whole that you can only achieve what you deserve because in order to achieve it, you have to reach a certain level of consciousness, to put it simply. I also forgot to add that the fact that I thought this amount of suffering would await me after death made me think of any human suffering as quite endurable compared to this.
I got psychotic 2 times in my life, both times for months. During those times, lots of truths were revealed to me that are hard to put into words. But in a nutshell, it felt like I was it, reality itself, and that everything around me was put there for me by my higher self. I could read the world around me like an open book. Everything spoke to me or off me, and it all made sense. I can't remember anymore, but back then I thought I had it all figured out, or was in the progress to. In hindsight, it was a deep spiritual adventure, but a dangerous one at times. I also behaved batshit insane, and can't allow it to happen again, hence the antipsychotics I take. Still not so sure what it really was. Something was teaching me something, I think, on a very unusual way and level.
Well, let's say when you have a psychotic episode, you got a hint of the way reality works.
You lost me here with the 20 years of torture. I don't get it. So you were told that you're the only soul to be damned. That's brutal. Existence is a dream. I define dream as a temporary manifestation of consciousness. Follow the bliss. Enjoyment is the point of existence. Looks like you took a wrong turn somewhere.
Well, it's simple. I believe that in my second try, I got captured by the Illuminati, just as in the first. Then they tortured me for 20 years until I was 43, and then they let me die. And yeah, that was quite brutal. It was the hardest thing to realize that I was not deserving of that cruel fate. Not that anyone is. And I do agree with you in a wide sense, but do you mean human existence is temporary, or existence overall is temporary? I mean, any existence you are experiencing is a temporary manifestation of consciousness like a dream. Existence, aka. Consciousness is permanent. Consciousness is the only thing that exists. You take your mind off of it. What happens? You go to sleep, you go into the void. But if you can maintain awareness, you will witness the singularity of bliss. It's all a singularity of consciousness. It just seems to be this and that. If you take it off the manifestation and only focus on the source, consciousness, infinite bliss will be experienced. Way I see it, it's like only God, aka consciousness, exists and it tries to look outside itself. But there's nothing there, so all it can find is illusions, dreams of consciousness. Bliss is a very real phenomenon of consciousness, but it's like it's too spread out into the manifestation. Everything is the delight of consciousness, and according to what I've read, you need to merge the manifest with the bliss from realizing the manifest is the singularity. I'm not there, but I will be. This philosophy is from Kashmir Shaivism, aka Trika Saivism, summed up.
I do agree with your first section. It is what I have come to realize as well. Although I do not think that all consciousness is temporary. I do think that there is a state of consciousness that we are all in, when we are not experiencing life as human, for example, that is permanent in a timeless way. I could go into detail, but it wouldn't be very useful, I think. I don't think, however, that consciousness tries to look outward. You are right that only God, aka consciousness, exists. I like to name it the source or creative source. I think this source bases all of its creation on the fact that it is, and therefore all being is based upon the joy of being. And as being always implies creation through perception, it also bases all of its creations on the joy of creating. Your bit about bliss is something I don't agree with, though. From the highest perspective, all being and all creation is bliss. Maybe I didn't describe it right, but totally agree what you said here, and is what I was trying to say.
I'm glad I was able to present it that well in your eyes. It is difficult with this sort of information. I'm also glad to see other people coming to the same conclusions. We are all looking at the same source, and the discovery of this opens up so many potentials for humanity. This is actually what I focus the most on. If anything in life, service is the most important to me. It is what brings me the most joy, and I'm so grateful for being able to experience life having a connection with this. Service means to me that I focus my entire life on creating that which is the most enabling of joy and well-love. Sadly, love, as most humans think of it these days, is like a parody of the actual love that exists and streams from the source. But then again, how helpful is it to judge those that feel about love in the conventional way? Of course, they are responsible for their being as a human, but it is a push-pull sort of thing, as they are also part of the collective consciousness. Sadly, most humans lack the awareness to begin changing their thought patterns and behaviors above a certain level. But instead of creating conflict or judgment to deal with it, which could be used as a tool to create positive change. But I am not willing to create any sort of creation which could cause suffering consciously. There will always be a difference in perspectives, but if we can change our approach at dealing with them. Thus, I try to deal with them from a logical and, most importantly, compassionate point. If there is anything that is important to me, it is being compassionate for everyone. I will be compassionate for them unconditionally. It is not only because it is the greater good, but because I recognize that we come from the same source and are the same being, in fact. This reality is like a movie inside the mind, where the individual does only exist within the context of the movie. This is something I could go on forever, really. I think once you fully realize that the other is capable of feeling the same joy or suffering, as you cannot create anything that does not respect this without being aware of it. In the end, you have to realize how God is part of you and see yourself in God to integrate Him in your life. And once this connection is established, life is like a miracle. I don't care if anyone believes me or not, but I get such intense shivers and feelings of compassion and joy, even in the most mundane moments, just by consciously working on my perception of others and realizing more compassion for them. Often even my eyes tear up a little, even when I'm just driving on the bus. I think to be able to do that, you have to realize that your life is not segmented into parts, but that you are always there, and that it is the most rewarding and gratifying to use your consciously at all times.
I feel a control panel on the small part of my back on my energy body and a living being connected to it. Also, I was in a psych hospital for a while because my mom didn't like how I smoked weed and laughed at night. Being an ascetic world ignorer is hard in a family home. I wish I could join some commune and just work with everyone for our own lives without any judgment if I decide to spend all my time smoking pot and giggling at the jokes the universe tells me. Anyway, before and while I was in the hospital, I had the inescapable belief that everyone on the planet and potentially everyone in the universe could and can hear my thoughts. People say what I thought shortly after I thought them. This happened quite a bit before I went to the hospital. At the hospital, the staff would literally finish my thoughts as I was having them, and I kept hearing everyone saying Gabriel repeatedly. Around that time, I kept thinking apologetically, things like, I'm sure there's some other universe where I can hear you just as clearly as you hear me now, and stuff like now, but I'm sure that probably would have just made people feel worse. Even as a kid, I had a fear that people could hear my thoughts. Usually just when I was alone with one other person in an enclosed space, I would think, can they hear me? For some reason they must. Oh, I also feel a triforce on the back of my right hand sometimes, so that's strange.
Thanks for contributing. While I think that your statement sounds a bit linear, and it seems to me that your values and ideals aren't quite as beneficial as mine, I still value that you are able to create joy in your life with that sort of sovereignty. Your psychosis itself sounds a little more normal to me, but I don't mean to diminish your experience. I think if you want to improve your life, you should perhaps work on your relationships with others. It is better to develop an approach of dealing with life in a benevolent way than to ignore it. That doesn't mean it has to be conventional of any kind. You can create your own. You just have to believe in your ability to create, which is sadly something that is quite discouraged by how society judges and all of that. I'm not implying that you are incompetent with dealing with life. I just wish to be of some service.
I know this isn't the precise thread to post this, but I have schizotypal personality disorder and hysteria. I'm using the old term for a reason. Most days I find myself believing that I'm a disembodied spirit who lives in an artificial environment of humans. I also believe in spirit possession, which has caused me to become physically disabled to where I can't walk, but my reality testing remains somewhat intact. So I was diagnosed with a few hysterical disorders because it was revealed that I experienced childhood abuse. Anyway, I've had some pretty intense experiences like spontaneous out-of-body experiences and the sight of form constants from nothing. I also hear the voices of what I believe to be otherworldly beings who see me as their vessel to this realm. I know it's bizarre, but I believe it anyway.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.